trying to lighten up your menu and add a little delicacy? Consider the submersion techniques. To define the category of submersion cooking, we need to look at three basic techniques: shallow poaching, deep poaching, and simmering. All techniques that involve moist heat cooking. Now, we think of moist heat cooking as tenderizing. However, most of the items that we apply, especially shallow poaching and deep poaching, are small and individual and are naturally tender, don't require long cooking. The simmering, we'll get into a few items that are not naturally tender and do require a little bit more cooking. The technique of shallow poaching is really very difficult. In fact, I think it's one of the more difficult, looking back on my experience here at the school, teaching skills, teaching this technique. To execute it properly, it requires a good bit of finesse. And that finesse usually comes a little bit later on. And I also think that I see this less in the industry, and it's because the pace is such that you can't execute it properly. So I think this is something that we really need to look into and bring our skills up and kind of bring it back in the industry. To define the shallow poach, this would be definitely an a la minute style of cooking, where you take a small, tender, portion-sized item, or even smaller items where there would be 2 or 3 per portion. Papillates of sole, for example, you might need 2 or 3 of those to complete one portion. And you're going to cook it in a small amount of liquid, right? The shallow poach differs from the deep poach in that you don't totally submerge the item. Basically, we say that the cooking liquid should come to about a half or at least a third of the way up the product. Now, to get even cooking, we need to cover that. My opinion is to use a piece of parchment paper that's been cut in a round shape and it has a little hole in the center. What that allows us to do is let some of the steam escape so that the temperature in that environment doesn't get too hot and go out of the poaching range. Remember, we said this is a shallow poach. If we're simmering in there, we're going to ruin the texture and possibly overcook the product that we're cooking. So if you were to cover it with a metal lid, I think the seal is a little too tight, prevents escape of steam and temperature, and so that's why I go with the parchment paper that's been lightly buttered. So you'll start your shallow poach on the top of the stove and get the cooking liquid up to poaching temperature. Cover it and then slide it into the oven to finish. Because you've covered it, you're creating a steaming environment. Shallow poach is really a combination of poaching and steaming, right? So with it covered, you have a cooking above the liquid line and below the liquid line, so it's even. Again, portion size item cooks pretty quickly. You're going to take it out and you might remove the proteins or whatever you're poaching and put them on the plate, and you need to quickly finish the sauce. And because you're not putting crosshatch marks, maybe from a grilled item on this shallow poach, the sauce really needs to be the star. In order for it to be the star, you're going to use that cooking liquid. You start off with a percentage of acidity, might be white wine, with a percentage of stock. And that is infused with the liquids that come out of the fish. If you're poaching fish, chicken, if you're poaching chicken, and what have you. As you reduce that down, that really becomes strong, flavorful item. You want to add a little richness. It could be in the form of heavy cream. It could be a thickener. Today you might have a veloute, which is basically a stock with a blonde roux, and that's going to help you get the viscosity and add some fat to that flavorful liquid, right? The liquid has great flavor, but it needs that kind of rich mouthfeel. It also needs a certain viscosity so that whenever we nappe it over these items, a certain amount stays on top. Again, I said there's no crosshatch marks, so the fish or the chicken, whatever you poached, isn't always the most pretty item, but whenever you hit it with a properly made sauce that's been created from that, we call it a cuisson, which is the actual poaching liquid that's been reduced and developed into a sauce, it should coat the product. We call it enrobé, whenever it's just enrobed. Whenever you do the same dish, a papillates of sole that's shallow poached time and time again, you kind of get almost like an extra sense of how long it takes. But again, we go back to the basics, and a professional should be or is expected to be able to determine doneness just by feel of portion size items, right? So if you have a small item, it's not necessary to stick a thermometer in it. You should be able to feel it, but there's a special look. Something like salmon with a little more fat content certainly could be poached, but we oftentimes see it in the deep poaching. It has a little higher fat content. The flavor compared to sole is greater, right? So that works out. The reason that you're gonna have a little higher fat content or want a little higher fat content is the cooking method is slightly less delicate. You're going to submerge these products completely, as opposed to with the shallow poach, just cover them halfway, into a very flavorful liquid, which is a key for deep poach. Cooking liquids, obviously key with deep poach. One of the more popular, or probably one of the most popular cooking liquids would be a court bouillon. Basically, you could call this a vegetable stock with an element of acidity, whether you like white wine or whether you like vinegar. I personally like the vinegar. Infused with aromatics, mirepoix, and then water to balance it out so it's not too tart. The combination make it something that you couldn't turn into a sauce like the cuisson that we used for the shallow poach, but nonetheless, it is very important. So that's why the court bouillon is so popular. It has the elements of acidity and it has the aromatics, but it's all balanced out, kind of brought into control with some water. There seems to be a little confusion between deep poach and simmering. Deep poaching differs from simmering, first of all, in the temperature. Obviously, simmering a little closer to boiling, but still not quite. I think very few things benefit from that kind of, especially proteins, from that kind of rambling high heat. They almost end up looking like they were freezer burned or something like that. Oftentimes with a deep poach, it's going to be a portion size item that's already naturally tender. Even though we think of the moist heat cooking techniques as techniques that tenderize items, simmering on the other hand, you might do a brisket of beef for a few hours to tenderize it. Most people can make really good food, small quantity, you know, we do it every day at home, but do that for 400. And so there are little tricks that you learn after you get some experience and you have good speed that you can get it all done in a timely manner. And basically timing with food is very important. If you have good timing, you can control what happens to the food and get it to the customer while it's at its peak. As far as where these submersion techniques fit into your operation, each one's a little bit different. Shallow poaching is an a la minute cooking technique and doesn't hold very well because it's a small item. So you're going to see this on the line a la carte style of service. However, the deep poach is something that can be done in larger quantity. Many times it is done a la minute, nothing wrong with that. But because the items are oftentimes a little larger, you can put, for an example, this 6-ounce tranche of salmon that we keep talking about. You can line those up in a hotel pan, pour the poaching liquid on, and then heat them up in an oven and a steamer on top of the stove, and take them off right at the perfect time, maybe where they're almost done, and hold them for service. The simmering also works pretty well for banquet as well as a la carte because you're cooking a larger item ahead of time most of the time, the brisket of beef. You simmer that until it's tender. You might take it out and hold it warm and slice it for a banquet. You can even pre-slice it and hold it in the liquid that it was cooked in. As far as equipment goes for submersion techniques, the shallow poach, you're going to need a sauteuse. You're going to need something to cover that sauteuse where the product and the cooking liquid is in there while it goes into the oven. If you don't cover it, you don't create that steaming environment. So not only are you not going to get an evenly cooked product, but you might brown the top of the item you're shallow poaching. With the deep poach, you're going to need a little bit of a larger pan. The sauteuse has smaller sides. You might need something like a small marmite or a soup or a sauce pot, something that gives you the depth to enable you to submerge the product you're going to poach it in. And you need some kind of a system to get down in that pot and remove the product. You might want to blot it for a few seconds after it comes out of the poaching liquid to drain off some of that excess liquid and keep that from diluting your sauce. And the simmering, again, maybe even a larger pot, depending on what you're simmering. A brisket of beef will take a full-size marmite, most likely. It would be great to see more of these cooking techniques done in the industry, and so if we can instill that that knowledge into the students, that it does have great flavor, it produces great results. It requires the finesse and it requires an attention to detail. that I think is higher than many other cooking techniques.
Submersion techniques will help you add variety and balance to your menus. Contrasting things like grills and roasts, the submersion techniques add very delicate natural flavors.